Hello! So as you guys probably know, I am a big fan of the fitted body, full skirt Tudor kirtle. Also increasingly a bit of a fan of the earlier medieval supportive kirtle. More on that in a future video. However, this has created one very specific problem, which is what on earth do I lace them up with? All of my Tudor kirtles, and so far at least one of the earlier kirtles, they're all lace up. You need quite a long lace, and so I'm casting around for a ribbon or a bit of trim or just anything that I have that is about the right length. I have previously used single strands of yarn, which I don't recommend. But I feel like there has to be a good answer for this. Not even necessarily historical way of making a lacing cord that is not too thick, not too thin, strong enough to hold up to being repeatedly pulled through eyelets. Okay to have tension on it, sometimes quite a lot of tension. So I've compiled a list of options and we're just going to go down and we're going to test each one and see at the end of it what I think the best lacing cord making method is. So I have a whole bunch of methods here that use yarn, but the first technique I thought I'd like to explore is actually rouleau, which is basically making a tiny tube of fabric. I know about rouleau, I've seen it, aware of its uses, but I've never actually made rouleau before, so I figured I could probably use some help with that. I went looking for a class on Craftsy, who is the sponsor of today's video. Craftsy is a fun and lively online community for all kinds of creative skills. With over 2,000 detailed video classes in more than 20 creative categories, for all ability levels, they're always creating new classes, taught by professional instructors who will walk you step by step through each demonstration, as well as live streaming tutorials. In my quest to learn rouleau, I particularly appreciated Alison Smith's class Sewing Lingerie Essential Techniques, which covered a whole series of techniques for working with delicate and slippery fabrics, lace, bias edges, adjustable bra straps, as well as, of course, rouleau. If you want to follow along with some of the other explorations I'm doing today, I'd recommend checking out the Startup Library Knitting class by Susan B. Anderson. It's all presented in a really accessible way, and I love how it doesn't just give you the techniques, but walks you through creating your first 3 projects. The Startup Library series actually covers introductions to a whole bunch of crafts. There's also a crochet version taught by Selena Baca, which is just as accessible and excellent. If you're feeling inspired and you'd like to join, the first 1,000 people to use my link will get a full year of premium Craftsy membership for only $1.49. To unlock this great offer, valid for new members only, either click the link in the video description or use the QR code that's on screen. I've really enjoyed Craftsy, I hope you do too. And now, let's explore some of these cordage options. So as the first up, obviously, we looked at rouleau. The technique I used for making it is one that has been described to me as making piping badly. I think the tube I made was too big, but I also struggled to turn this tube, and I think I would have struggled even more if I'd made it even thinner. I also made the test piece in silk, which has many properties, but slippery is generally one of them. And I'm just thinking if I was generally making this to match the dresses I was making, it's probably going to be like quilting cotton, which is very grippy. The speed of making was good. I think I could relatively easily make a long enough piece of rouleau for a lacing cord. I think turning a piece of rouleau that big would be interesting. I would probably have to plan as part of the sewing process that I was going to need to take off this big long strip of fabric. It was relatively easy. It wasn't super easy. Once I got it turning, it was pretty much okay, but it was kind of fiddly and unsatisfying, and I don't know that I love the finished result. I'd have to experiment a lot more, which put us solidly in the category of yarn-based cords, which is kind of where I thought I was going to end up anyway. Not really a surprise, I was prepared. We've established that just using a single piece of yarn as a lace works for about 3 washes, and then you're in trouble. So the first thing I briefly looked at was, could you just crochet? Because doing just a long chain of crochet is a really, really quick way to make that yarn thicker, sturdier, more durable. In theory, the problem with crochet is that, at least in a single long chain, I think that if you broke the yarn at any point for any reason, the whole thing would unravel very, very quickly. Crochet is very live. easy to unravel. If you make a hole in your crochet, it's going to get very interesting very quickly. It was very easy to do, it was very quick. It was not very even, just by the nature of how crochet chains are. You have points where the yarn is doubling back on itself multiple times and points where it's not. So it kind of goes thick, thin, thick, thin, thick, thin, thick, thin the whole way along. This is just the nature of the beast. I'm experienced enough in crochet to know I didn't do anything wrong. That's what crochet chains are like. So while I think I could do this if I was desperate, I don't think it's actually that much better than using a single strand of yarn, which is what I would do if I was desperate. I'm just adding extra steps and not extra functionality. So the next thing I tried is I-cord. I didn't have super high hopes for this because knitting is a little bit more stable than crochet in that if you break one thread, you will develop a hole, but that hole will take time to spread to the whole piece. You're not immediately going to unravel the whole chain. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So I-cord is a way of making a long, thin tube of knitting. You do this with 2 double-pointed needles, and basically what you do is knit however many stitches. 3 is a very common number. You can also do 4, possibly do 2. I don't think I've ever done 2. You could probably do more if you wanted. You knit however many stitches, and instead of turning it around and knitting back, you slide the knitting to the other end of the double pointed needle. That's why they have to be double pointed. Pull the yarn to the beginning of the row again and just keep knitting. So you end up with a tube of stockinette because you are knitting from the same side of the stitches every single time. And by that action of just bringing the yarn from the end of the row to the beginning of the row again, you create this tube. It's not the most time-consuming thing in the world, but it's close. Like, I sat down with a timer and I was like, how much I-cord can I make in 10 minutes? And the answer is not very much. Making a very, very long piece of I-cord was going to take an extremely long length of time. It does still suffer from the crochet problem of if you break one of these threads, there aren't that many stitches, so that hole will start unraveling quite quickly, and you can potentially just have it unravel and break apart relatively quickly. I-cord is quite bulky, and also it's stretchy, which is not the best thing for a lacing cord. So I-cord wasn't looking good. Because I am a curious creature, I was like, well, what if, because I know you can do I-cord on a knitting machine, and then I discovered that they make a special little knitting machine just for making I-cord. I didn't actually get this for this project. I got this because I have seen people use it with embroidery to create like very large embroidery thread tubes that you can then use as part of your embroidery and just cover very big areas. The artist Amber Griffiths, or Ambroidering, uses it a lot for making like bones and blood vessels, and that looks really cool. I thought I'd give it a try just in case it was a different quality of I-cord, like if it had different properties than the stuff I was doing on 2 needles, because that can sometimes be the case. The I-cord knitting mill has 4 stitches. They're latch hooks just like on a flatbed, or I believe also a circular sock knitting machine. Don't have one of those yet. We did get a new 3D printer. Future video problems. The knitting mill took a little bit of getting used to. The weight that it comes with is quite heavy. So initially I tried just tying the end of the yarn to this weight. That didn't super work. The yarn broke. It needed more strands to be able to hold the full weight. So I ended up tensioning it by just like holding the end and pulling it down every couple of rounds. But that tensioning issue was the main problem that I had with the I-cord mill. Everything else was pretty smooth sailing. It caught all the stitches as it was supposed to. It didn't need a lot of attention. I could go pretty fast. I could go really fast, actually. The speed with which this thing would just churn out I-cord was pretty cool. The problem, of course, is because it was 4 stitches and actually the tension wasn't very high, so the I-cord was even chunkier and stretchier and sort of looser than the I-cord I was making with the needles, because my knitting tension is pretty tight. There's nothing tensioning the yarn going in. I guess you could, but there's only so many hands, and this hand is tensioning the bottom so it pulls down. down and form stitches properly, and the other hand's turning the crank, so there's not like a third hand to tension the yarn going in. I think you just kind of have to accept that this is going to produce chunky, bouncy I-cord, which is fine, but completely unsuitable for the project that we're doing. So having ruled out knitting and crochet, the two generally accepted, well understood fibre crafts, we were into weird, niche fibre crafts. I tried to start off relatively accessible. This is something that I have done before, which is just braiding. If any of you, like me, are recovering from having extremely long hair, you probably already know how to do at least some plaits. I have actually done a 3-strand regular braid as a lacing cord before. Works pretty well. It's not the quickest. In particular, when you're doing with a really, really long braid, the ends get tangled very, very easily. That's a problem. But it's also not the slowest. It's much quicker than doing I-cord on 2 needles. It's pretty durable. It doesn't have the unraveling problem in that if you snap one yarn, the other 2 threads will hold it. And because they sort of lock together each twist, if you snap one yarn, it generally will take a while to work its way up the braid. So you've got a long time between wearing through one thread and having to replace the whole braid. Unfortunately, yeah, having to replace the whole braid is your option at that point. Could argue that 3 threads is not enough strength. However, you can do plaits or braids with many strands, basically as many strands as you want. 4-stranded braids are pretty common. There are 2 main ways of doing 4-stranded braids. You can either do a flat 4-stranded braid, which is subtly different than a 3-strand, or you can do a round 4-stranded braid, which gets used a lot in making friendship bracelets and decorative jewelry cord, which is way more of like a twisting method. And then once you get over 4 strands, I don't think I've ever really seen someone do like a 5 or a 6, but 7 and 9-strand braids are relatively common. And at that point, you're doing something a bit more like a weaving technique, and those always come out flat, which is fine. A thin, flat braid is not necessarily a bad thing for lacing. They can lie quite nicely, they can look quite elegant. It's not really different from using, say, a ribbon. So these aren't the most time-consuming. They're somewhat time-consuming. Better than I-cord on the needles. Obviously, much worse than I-cord on the mill. The more strands you add, the more durable it is. They are very tight, so they don't tend to be very big. If you're reasonable about the yarn that you're using, it's actually not going to be as bulky as the I-cord of the same yarn is, even though in theory you're using about the same number of strands of yarn. They also do not stretch at all, which is good, but they are a pain in the neck to do. I find dealing with the tails, especially on a really, really long braid, really annoying and difficult. You spend a lot of time untangling the part you haven't braided yet, especially for braids with a lot of strands, can get really confusing and difficult. You also have to be able to like hold even tension, and you have to be able to tension them against something, so it's not the most accessible option in the world. I think many people could have a go, but equally, that's a lot of pulling on things evenly with your hands and holding a lot of strands, and you can't super easily put it down and pick it back up again. You kind of can. You've got to be careful with it. So those feel like a solid maybe. Like, I have used them in the past. I normally just cannot be bothered making one because they're so annoying. So that gets us into the next category of braiding, and for this we are going back to the period that these dresses came from, and I figured it was time I finally tested out Fingerloop braiding. So Fingerloop braiding is a medieval method of weaving a very tight, fine, usually round braid. The way you do Fingerloop braid is that you need a fixed point to attach the ends to, and then you hold the loops on your fingers, hence Fingerloop braiding, and you sort of weave your fingers between the loops, picking them up and passing them backwards and forwards between your hands in a set pattern. There's a bunch of patterns. Like, I'm led to believe that there is a huge array of patterns that we have identified out of either extant artifacts or period sources, and possibly people have also invented their own through experimentation. It feels like a really cool new craft you could get into that has a lot of variation and options. The basic idea is not that complicated, and you're using multiple yarns, so you can experiment with color in a way that you can do with like braids and that, but is not so easy with, say, like the I-cord. The downside to finger loop braiding, well, there's a few downsides to finger loop braiding. Let's talk about the good things first. It's not that difficult. It's reasonably quick. I would say it's quicker than braiding and slightly easier to manage because all of the strands are loops and you have them hooked onto your fingers. I found that easier to manage than trying to hold on to 9 different strands of yarn. The braid it creates is quite dense, it's quite heavily interwoven. I think if you did wear through one yarn, you'd be okay for a while. Again, it would eventually unravel, but there's quite a lot of yarns in any given piece of the braid, tightly packed together. So it's not too bulky and it's not stretchy. It's maybe a little bit stretchy, but like minimally, not like I-cord stretchy. And as previously mentioned, there's a whole bunch of different patterns you can do and that you can experiment with color, a lot of options. However, the downsides. I found it was easy to learn, but surprisingly hard to find a place to learn from. There's one person on TikTok I know who does a bunch of stuff, and then there's about 12 to 20 videos on YouTube, many of which are doing the same basic pattern. And in a bunch of them, they're like, oh yeah, there's loads more patterns. But I found it really difficult to figure out where people were getting those patterns from. I saw one pattern written down and it was incomprehensible, and none of the videos that I personally watched told you how to read finger loop braid patterns. It may be that there's like a trove of information I'm missing out on here, but so far it doesn't seem to be a difficult skill to pick up, but it seems to be difficult to find someone who will teach you. I will collate some videos, the ones that I have found, for the people who do want to learn. It was a lot of fun, it was very repetitive, there was also a lot of arm movement, which again I think is maybe not going to be the most accessible thing in the world, but the biggest problem I found was that you are very limited in the length of braid that you can make. Even I have a above average wingspan for my height. Not by much, but by enough. I was struggling to make anything longer than about maybe a meter. My wingspan is much bigger than a meter because of how it shrinks up as it weaves the yarns together, and the fact that at its absolute biggest, so when you have all of the loops just secured at the end and you haven't even started weaving yet, the longest it should be is that. You're not going to be able to make a very long braid. Now, I have seen people get around this, but it takes friends. I've seen people say you can bodge it a bit with your feet. I don't know how you'd do that. I can't picture it in my head. I mean, okay, I kind of can if you like poke your feet between and stretch. It sounds weird and convoluted. The other way people mainly do this is that they get a friend. Presumably you weave them, hand half them off, and you pull in different directions because you can move further apart. Not super feasible for me to do on my own. So while finger loop braiding is super cool and I'd love to do it more, it's not really a practical solution for this specific problem, which, while I was on the sort of medieval Renaissance crafts, that led me onto the final cord exploration I wanted to do in this video, which is a lucet. So a lucet is a tool for making lucet cord. It's a little thing that has 2 prongs on it, and you wrap the yarn around it, or thread, or whatever you're using, sort of like a knitting dolly. You lift the stitch below over the stitch above, and it slowly produces this cord. So I acquired myself a lucet, courtesy of the new 3D printer. I set about having a go. So it's not as easy as I thought it would be, is my first takeaway. There's an amount of tensioning that has to happen. So I'm used to, when you're working with something, having to tension it by pulling on the bottom of the work. That's quite a normal experience for me. That's what you had to do with the I-cord mill. It's what you have to do with a knitting machine. It's what you had to do essentially with finger loop braid, is because you're pulling on it to keep the tension. With the lucet, I found that not only did I have to tension on the bottom, but that wasn't quite as important, as every time I lifted the stitches up, I would then have to pull the stitches tight by pulling on the working end of the yarn. It took me a while to figure that out. It was a bit rubbish before then, and then I got to it and it improved significantly, but not perfectly. I think my tensioning is bad, or not bad, but were imperfect. My tensioning was variable, which is not good in a fiber craft. You can do many things in many fiber crafts, but in all of them, tension should be consistent. So that wasn't great. It does produce a very fine, very dense, very not stretchy cord. And you can make that cord as long as you want. As long as you are willing to keep going, you can just keep making more and more Lucet cord. It's not quick. I would not like to put it against making I-cord. I think they're probably pretty close, actually, which is annoying. It's not a quick way of making cord, but the cord it makes is really good. It's dense, it's got lots of threads in it, the threads are all interlocked. I suspect you would have problems if you wore through one of the threads, but I actually don't know. I have no personal experience in this regard, how quickly it would unravel. It could be super quick, it could be it doesn't unravel at all. However, in spite of all the drawbacks, so far, this is the best method I've found. Yes, it's slow. Yes, I'd have questions about its durability. Yes, I need to get better at it, but the cord it produces is good. It's easy. It was easy to learn. It's easy to find information about making Lucet cord online, in books, whatever. It's easy to manage because it's one working end and then one cord. Yes, you need a specific tool, but that specific tool is relatively easy to come by. You can buy one, or you can 3D print one, or you could probably make one. They don't have to be very complicated. It is basically just a thing with two prongs on it. So I think what I'm deciding is that future projects, Lucet cord might be the way to go. But it did get me thinking, what if there was a way of making a cord that was densely woven, lots of individual threads interlocking, like Fingerloop Braid or the regular braids, potentially a bit quicker? Maybe I'm willing to accept that it maybe wouldn't be quicker than Fingerloop braiding, but if it was about the same speed, that'd be nice. But with some way of using longer working threads so that you could have a longer end braid, but also keep all of those threads like nicely managed. And if you could add in some way that it was just like really easy to put aside and come back to, so you didn't have to do the whole thing in one sitting, I think that'd be pretty much perfect. It's kind of a shame that it doesn't really exist. And then I found this on Facebook Marketplace. I'm willing to bet most of the people watching this don't know what this is. But for those of you who do, you're gonna have to wait for another video. I could not learn a new craft in 2 weeks. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to keep the YouTube gods happy. Follow me on Tumblr as I rapidly abandon every other form of social media in favor of the hell site from 2014. Come on in. It's quite nice now. The water's lovely. This morning I got to see an ancient Egyptian glass fish, and it made my day. Down in the description box, you'll find a link to my Ko-fi page where you can make a one-off or reoccurring donation to support the channel. You can also consider becoming a channel member, which gets you early access to all of my videos, a bunch of other fun little perks and extras, and I also write a monthly blog, which is mostly about books that I have read. It gets posted in both places, so if you're desperate to know what I thought of Heavenly Tyrant, you can go either way. Both of these are great ways to support the channel and support me as I attempt to learn every fiber craft in the world. And I couldn't do what I do without your help. Seriously, it's becoming a problem. I just have this compulsive need to find out more. That's enough of that. Dream big, and I'll see you next time.